Sarah Mitchell's boots echoed against the wooden planks of Dust Creek's main street as she stepped down from the stagecoach, her emerald dress a stark contrast against the dusty browns and weathered grays of the frontier town. The year was 1847, and this remote Colorado settlement had seen more blood than rain in recent months. What brought a refined Eastern lady to such a godforsaken place was a question that would soon shake the very foundations of everything the townspeople believed about justice, redemption, and the thin line between hero and villain. The commotion ahead drew her attention immediately. A crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, their voices rising in an ugly chorus of anger and bloodlust. Through the gaps between shoulders and hat brims, Sarah caught her first glimpse of him. A man bound with thick rope, his dark hair falling across a face marked by both violence and something else she couldn't quite name. This was Jake Morrison, the notorious outlaw whose gang had terrorized the territory for 3 years running. Sheriff Tom Bradley raised his weathered hand, trying to calm the mob that had formed around his prisoner. The lawman's silver badge caught the harsh afternoon sun as he shouted over the crowd. "Now hold on there, folks. This man's gonna get a fair trial before we do anything permanent." But his words fell on deaf ears. The people of Dust Creek had suffered too much at the hands of Morrison's gang-stolen cattle, burned homesteads, and 3 dead men who tried to stand up to the outlaws. "Fair trial, my foot," spat Walter Jenkins, the town's blacksmith, his massive fists clenched tight around a horseshoe that looked more like a weapon than a tool. "This snake killed my brother-in-law down in Silverton. String him up now and save the territory some money." The crowd's agreement rumbled like approaching thunder, and several men began eyeing the sturdy oak tree that stood in the town square, its branches thick enough to bear the weight of frontier justice. That's when Sarah Mitchell did something that stopped every soul in Dust Creek dead in their tracks. She walked straight through the crowd, her heels clicking with determination, and positioned herself directly between Jake Morrison and the angry mob. "Don't beat him," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "I'll buy him." The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a gunshot, and for a moment, nobody seemed to breathe. Jake Morrison himself looked up at this unexpected defender, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was surprise there and confusion, but also something deeper, a flicker of the man he might have been before the frontier had hardened him into the killer he'd become. Sarah saw it immediately, that spark of humanity that everyone else had given up for lost. Sheriff Bradley was the first to find his voice. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean by buy him, but this here's Jake Morrison we're talking about. He's wanted for robbery, cattle rustling, and murder across 3 territories. The bounty on his head could feed a family for 2 years." He gestured toward the prisoner with a mixture of respect for Sarah's obvious breeding and bewilderment at her strange request. "I mean exactly what I said, Sheriff," Sarah replied, reaching into her leather satchel to produce a roll of bills thick enough to make several men in the crowd gasp audibly. "I'll pay his bounty, his legal fees, and any damages the town claims he owes. In return, I want custody of this man." She looked directly at Jake Morrison as she spoke these words, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding that would prove to be the first thread in a tapestry of secrets that would soon unravel. The crowd erupted in protests and disbelief. Mary Henderson, the preacher's wife, pushed forward with her bonnet askew and her face flushed with indignation. "Young lady, have you taken leave of your senses? This man is a cold-blooded killer. He'll slit your throat the moment you turn your back." But Sarah's resolve never wavered. She'd come to Dust Creek with a purpose that none of these people could understand, and she wasn't about to be deterred by their fears or their thirst for revenge. "You call this outlaw a criminal," Sarah said, her voice rising to address the entire crowd. "But I see a man who can change." Her words cut through the desert heat like a blade, sharp and clean and utterly unexpected. Jake Morrison's head snapped up, and for the first time since his capture, something other than defiance flickered across his features. It was hope, fragile and uncertain, but unmistakably real. The mystery of Sarah Mitchell's arrival in Dust Creek ran deeper than anyone in the crowd could have imagined. 3 months earlier, she had received a letter that changed everything she thought she knew about her family's past. The letter bore her father's handwriting, but her father had been dead for 10 years, killed, according to the official report, by Jake Morrison's gang during a stagecoach robbery outside Denver. The letter was brief and cryptic, containing only an address in Dust Creek and the words, "Find Jake Morrison. The truth isn't what you think it is. Trust him with your life, because he once saved mine." The impossibility of that letter had haunted Sarah's dreams for months. How could a dead man write to his daughter? How could he ask her to trust the very outlaw who had supposedly killed him? The questions had driven her from her comfortable life in Boston all the way to this dusty Colorado settlement, carrying nothing but the mysterious letter, a substantial inheritance, and a determination to uncover the truth no matter what it cost her. Sheriff Bradley scratched his graying beard as he considered Sarah's unprecedented offer. In all his years wearing the badge, he'd never encountered anything quite like this situation. The law was clear about bounties and criminal justice, but it was also clear about private property and individual rights. If this woman had the money to pay Morrison's debts to society, and if she was willing to take responsibility for his actions, then legally speaking, there might be a way to make her unusual request work. "Miss Mitchell," the sheriff said carefully, "even if I could arrange something like what you're proposing, this man would still be your responsibility. Any crime he commits, any person he hurts, any property he damages, it would all fall on your head. Are you prepared for that kind of burden?" His tone was gentle but firm, the voice of a man who'd seen too much of human nature's darker side to believe in easy redemption. Jake Morrison spoke for the first time since Sarah's arrival, his voice rough from days in the desert sun but carrying an educated accent that surprised everyone who heard it. "Lady, you don't know what you're asking for. I appreciate the gesture, but these people are right about me. I'm not worth saving, and I'm sure as hell not worth dying for." There was pain in his words, the deep ache of a man who'd given up on himself long before the world had given up on him. But Sarah had heard something in his voice that confirmed what she'd suspected from the moment she'd seen him. This wasn't just any outlaw. This was a man with secrets of his own, a man whose story was far more complicated than the wanted posters suggested. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I didn't come all the way from Boston to have second thoughts now. The question isn't whether you're worth saving. The question is whether you're willing to be saved." The crowd fell silent again, sensing that something momentous was happening here, something that went beyond their simple desire for frontier justice. Even Walter Jenkins lowered his makeshift weapon, caught up despite himself in the drama unfolding before his eyes. This wasn't just about an outlaw and his crimes anymore. This was about redemption, about second chances, about the possibility that even the most hardened criminal might find a path back to humanity. Sheriff Bradley made his decision with the weight of Solomon's wisdom. "All right, Miss Mitchell. If you can post bond for Mr. Morrison's crimes and agree to be legally responsible for his actions, I'll release him into your custody. But he wears shackles until we reach some kind of formal arrangement, and if he so much as looks at you wrong, I'll put him back in chains faster than you can blink." The sheriff's compromise satisfied neither the bloodthirsty crowd nor Jake Morrison himself, but it opened a door that had seemed permanently closed just moments before. As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, grumbling about Eastern interference and misplaced mercy, Sarah found herself alone with the two men who would shape her destiny in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Sheriff Bradley unlocked Jake Morrison's cell but left the shackles in place, a reminder that trust was something that would have to be earned one careful step at a time. The boarding house where Sarah had taken a room was run by Martha Caldwell, a widow whose husband had been one of Jake Morrison's supposed victims 2 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone when Sarah requested a second room for her new charge. But Martha's need for paying customers outweighed her desire for revenge, at least temporarily. "I'll give you the room," Martha said coldly. "But if that murderer so much as breathes wrong, I'll fill him full of buckshot myself." That first evening in Dust Creek revealed the first crack in the official story of Jake Morrison's crimes. As Sarah sat across from him in the boarding house's small dining room, she noticed something that had escaped everyone else's attention: Jake Morrison's hands. They were soft, uncalloused, the hands of a man who'd spent more time holding a pen than a gun. For an outlaw who'd supposedly spent 3 years living rough and robbing stagecoaches, his hands told a very different story. "You're not what you seem," "Are you Mr. Morrison?" Sarah asked quietly, keeping her voice low enough that Martha Caldwell couldn't overhear from the kitchen. Jake's gray eyes flickered with something that might have been relief or might have been fear. It was impossible to tell which. "Lady, nothing in this whole damn territory is what it seems. The sooner you learn that, the longer you're likely to live." The mystery deepened when Sarah showed Jake the letter from her father. His reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He recognized the handwriting, and more than that, he recognized the words. "Your father," he said slowly, "was Thomas Mitchell?" When Sarah nodded, Jake Morrison's entire demeanor changed. The hardened outlaw facade cracked completely, revealing something Sarah hadn't expected to see: grief, raw and unhealed, as if her father's death had wounded this supposed killer as deeply as it had wounded her. "Miss Mitchell," Jake said carefully, "if your father wrote that letter, then he wrote it before he died. And if he told you to trust me, then he knew something that these people don't. Your father wasn't just another stagecoach passenger. He was the best friend I ever had." The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, connecting two people whose lives had been shaped by the same mysterious tragedy. The truth began to emerge in fragments over the following days. Thomas Mitchell hadn't been killed by Jake Morrison's gang. He had been Jake Morrison's gang, at least according to the official records. But the real story was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous than anything the wanted posters had ever suggested. Sarah's father had been working undercover for the territorial government, investigating a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Colorado's emerging political structure. The gang that bore Jake Morrison's name had actually been a cover identity, a way for Thomas Mitchell and his partner to infiltrate the real criminal organization that was bleeding the territory dry. When Thomas Mitchell died, it wasn't in a stagecoach robbery. It was in a secret meeting with territorial officials who had discovered his true identity and decided he knew too much to live. Jake Morrison had been there that night, had tried to save his friend's life, and had barely escaped with his own. For 3 years, Jake had maintained the fiction of being an outlaw leader because it was the only thing keeping him alive. The real criminals were powerful men with legitimate businesses and political connections, men who could have him killed in any jail cell in the territory if they discovered he knew the truth about Thomas Mitchell's death. By playing the role of a wanted man, Jake had stayed one step ahead of both the law and the real villains, gathering evidence that he hoped would someday clear his name and bring his friend's killers to justice. Sarah's arrival in Dust Creek had changed everything. Her father's letter meant that Thomas Mitchell had found a way to communicate beyond the grave, probably through an arrangement with someone he trusted implicitly. But it also meant that Sarah was now in deadly danger herself. If the men who had killed her father learned that she knew the truth, they would stop at nothing to silence her permanently. The first attempt on Sarah's life came on her 4th night in Dust Creek. She was awakened by the sound of her bedroom window being carefully opened, and only Jake Morrison's vigilant watch saved her from the knife that flashed in the moonlight. The would-be assassin escaped into the darkness, but his presence confirmed Jake's worst fears. The conspiracy that had killed Thomas Mitchell was still very much alive, and Sarah Mitchell had become its newest target. "We have to leave Dust Creek," Jake told her as they huddled together in her room, waiting for dawn and trying to make sense of what had just happened. "These men won't stop until you're dead, and they won't care who else they have to kill to get to you. Your father made me promise to protect you if anything ever happened to him, and I mean to keep that promise even if it costs me my life." But Sarah Mitchell hadn't come all the way from Boston to run away at the first sign of danger. She had inherited more than just her father's money. She had inherited his courage and his determination to see justice done. "Mr. Morrison," she said firmly, "these men killed my father because he was getting close to exposing them. If we run now, they win. If we stay and fight, we might lose our lives, but at least we'll have a chance to make them pay for what they've done." The conspiracy they were fighting reached deeper into Colorado's power structure than either of them had initially realized. The territorial governor himself was involved, along with several prominent businessmen and at least 3 federal marshals. They had been systematically looting the territory's resources while using outlaws like Jake Morrison as scapegoats to cover their own crimes. Thomas Mitchell had died because he had discovered documents that proved their guilt beyond any shadow of doubt. Those documents were hidden somewhere in Dust Creek, according to the cryptic clues in Thomas Mitchell's final letter. Finding them would require Sarah and Jake to work together, trusting each other completely despite the fact that everything they thought they knew about each other had been built on lies and misconceptions. It was a partnership that neither of them had wanted but both of them desperately needed. The transformation of Jake Morrison from feared outlaw to reluctant hero wasn't immediate or easy. Years of living as a wanted man had left him suspicious of everyone and everything, unable to trust even his own instincts when it came to other people's motives. But Sarah's unwavering faith in his essential goodness slowly began to chip away at the walls he had built around his heart, revealing the man her father had known and trusted with his life. As they searched for the hidden evidence that would clear Jake's name and expose the real criminals, Sarah began to understand why her father had seen potential for redemption in this complicated, wounded man. Jake Morrison might have been forced to live as an outlaw, but he had never lost his moral compass. Every crime attributed to his gang had been carefully orchestrated to minimize harm to innocent people. Every robbery had targeted only those who could afford the loss, and every act of violence had been a last resort when no other option remained. The climax of their dangerous partnership came when they finally located Thomas Mitchell's hidden cache of evidence. It was concealed in the most unlikely place imaginable, the basement of the very boarding house where they had been staying, hidden beneath Martha Caldwell's own floorboards. The widow's deceased husband hadn't been one of Jake Morrison's victims after all. He had been Thomas Mitchell's local contact, killed by the real conspirators when they discovered his role in the investigation. Martha Caldwell's shocked revelation that she had been harboring the evidence of her husband's real killers for 2 years added another layer of complexity to an already tangled web of deception. She had spent all this time hating Jake Morrison for a crime he hadn't committed, while the actual murderers walked free and continued their corruption of everything her husband had died trying to protect. The final confrontation came not in a dusty street at high noon, but in the elegant confines of the Territorial Capitol building in Denver. Armed with her father's evidence and backed by Jake Morrison's testimony, Sarah Mitchell faced down the corrupt officials who had destroyed so many lives in their pursuit of illegal wealth. The revelation of their crimes sent shockwaves through Colorado's political establishment and cleared Jake Morrison's name once and for all. Justice in the Old West was often rough and imperfect, but on this occasion it was both swift and complete. The corrupt governor and his co-conspirators found themselves facing the very gallows they had intended for Jake Morrison, while the man they had painted as a dangerous outlaw emerged as an unlikely hero whose sacrifice and courage had helped expose one of the territory's greatest scandals. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Jake Morrison became legend throughout the Colorado Territory and beyond. It was a tale that captured the imagination of a nation still struggling to define itself, a story that proved redemption was possible even in the harshest circumstances, and that sometimes the line between hero and villain was far thinner than anyone realized. In the end, Sarah Mitchell's faith in human redemption had been vindicated completely. The man she had seen beneath Jake Morrison's outlaw facade had proven to be everything she had hoped and more. A person of integrity and courage who had been willing to sacrifice everything to protect the innocent and expose the truth. Her father's final letter had led her not just to justice for his murder, but to a deeper understanding of the complexity of human nature and the power of second chances. The transformation was complete when Jake Morrison traded his outlaw's reputation for a badge, becoming one of the most effective lawmen in Colorado Territory's history. The skills he had learned while living outside the law served him well in his new role as a protector of justice, and his intimate knowledge of criminal methods made him nearly unstoppable in his pursuit of those who preyed upon the innocent. Sarah Mitchell remained in the West, using her inheritance to establish schools and hospitals throughout the growing territory. Her partnership with Jake Morrison evolved from desperate alliance to deep friendship to something even more profound. A love story that proved even the most unlikely circumstances could bring together two souls destined to change each other's lives forever. The legend of the Eastern lady who saw potential for redemption in a condemned outlaw became one of the most enduring tales of the American frontier. A story that reminded generations of Americans that courage, faith, and the willingness to look beyond surface appearances could triumph over even the most entrenched corruption and injustice. Years later, when historians studied the early development of Colorado Territory, they would point to the Mitchell-Morrison case as a turning point in the region's evolution from lawless frontier to civilized state. The exposure of the conspiracy that had masqueraded as law enforcement led to comprehensive reforms that laid the groundwork for honest government and genuine justice. But for those who lived through those dramatic days in Dust Creek, the real lesson was simpler and more personal. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals wear badges and hold elected office, while the truest heroes are those who have been forced by circumstances to live outside society's rules. And sometimes, it takes an outsider's fresh perspective to see past the lies and legends to the complicated truth that lies beneath. Sarah Mitchell's decision to trust a condemned man based on nothing more than her father's cryptic final message had seemed like madness to everyone who witnessed it. But her faith in human redemption had uncovered a conspiracy that might have continued for years if not for her courage and Jake Morrison's reluctant cooperation in seeking justice for the man they had both loved. The story became a testament to the power of looking beyond appearances, of refusing to accept easy answers to complex questions, and of believing that even the most fallen person might still contain the spark of something better. In the harsh world of the American frontier, where survival often depended on quick judgments and faster guns, it was a revolutionary idea that changed countless lives for the better. The years that followed brought changes to Dust Creek that nobody could have predicted on that fateful afternoon when Sarah Mitchell first stepped between Jake Morrison and an angry mob. The small frontier settlement grew into a prosperous town, its main street lined with proper storefronts and its dusty thoroughfares replaced by wooden sidewalks that no longer echoed with the sound of gunfights and vigilante justice. Sheriff Tom Bradley often reflected on the strange twist of fate that had transformed his quiet jail into the center of a territorial scandal. In his final years wearing the badge, he would tell anyone who would listen about the day an Eastern lady taught a frontier town the difference between justice and revenge. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," he would say, settling into his chair outside the sheriff's office. "But I never saw anything quite like watching that Morrison fellow change from outlaw to lawman. Makes a man think about second chances, it surely does." Martha Caldwell's boarding house became something of a shrine to the memory of her husband's true heroism. The basement room where Thomas Mitchell's evidence had been hidden was converted into a small museum, displaying the documents that had exposed the conspiracy and the letter that had started it all. Visitors came from across the territory to see the place where corruption had finally met its match, and Martha took pride in telling them about the widow who had unknowingly sheltered the proof of her husband's courage for 2 long years. The transformation of Jake Morrison from wanted outlaw to respected lawman became the stuff of dime novels and traveling shows, though the real man bore little resemblance to the larger-than-life figure that popular culture created from his story. He wore his badge with quiet dignity, never forgetting the lessons learned during his years as a fugitive. The criminals he pursued found him to be relentless but fair, a man who understood both sides of the law with equal clarity. Walter Jenkins, the blacksmith who had once called for Jake Morrison's immediate execution, became one of the reformed outlaw's most stalwart supporters. "I was wrong about him," Walter would admit to anyone who asked, his massive hands now crafting horseshoes instead of wielding them as weapons. "Sometimes a man's got to eat his words, and these particular words tasted pretty bitter going down. But I'm glad I was wrong. This territory's a better place with Jake Morrison wearing a badge instead of running from one." The political ramifications of the conspiracy's exposure reached all the way to Washington, where territorial governance was restructured to prevent such widespread corruption from taking root again. New oversight mechanisms were put in place, and the federal marshals who had participated in the conspiracy were replaced by men whose integrity was beyond question. Colorado Territory's path to statehood was accelerated as a result, with the Mitchell-Morrison case serving as proof that the region was ready for full self-governance. Sarah Mitchell schools and hospitals flourished throughout the growing territory, each one bearing a small plaque that read in memory of Thomas Mitchell, who died seeking justice. But her greatest legacy was more personal and infinitely more precious. On a warm spring morning in 1849, she became Mrs. Jake Morrison in a ceremony that drew visitors from hundreds of miles away, all wanting to witness the wedding of the century's most unlikely couple. The marriage ceremony itself took place in Dust Creek's newly built church, with Sheriff Bradley serving as Jake's best man and Martha Caldwell as Sarah's matron of honor. The guest list included former outlaws and territorial governors, frontier settlers and Boston socialites, all united in their recognition that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. Even the preacher, a man not given to flowery language, called it a union blessed by providence and sanctified by the redemption of souls. As the years passed, the legend of Sarah and Jake Morrison grew into something larger than the people themselves had ever been. Their story was told around campfires and in parlors, adapted for the stage and serialized in newspapers from coast to coast. Each telling added new details and dramatic flourishes, until the simple truth of two people finding each other in the midst of chaos became an epic tale of love conquering all obstacles. But those who knew them personally understood that the real story was quieter and more profound than any legend could capture. It was the story of two damaged souls healing each other through trust and understanding. Sarah had lost her father to corruption and violence, while Jake had lost his identity and his place in the world. Together, they had found something neither could have achieved alone, a sense of purpose that transcended their individual pain. The children who eventually filled their home inherited both their mother's compassion and their father's hard-earned wisdom about the complexity of human nature. They grew up understanding that heroes and villains were not always easily distinguished, that redemption was possible for anyone willing to seek it, and that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was look beyond surface appearances to see the potential that lay beneath. Jake Morrison lived to see Colorado achieve statehood, serving as one of the new state's first elected sheriffs and helping to establish the law enforcement standards that would govern the region for generations. His badge became a symbol of transformation and second chances, inspiring countless other men to believe that their past mistakes did not have to define their future possibilities. Sarah Morrison's influence extended far beyond her husband's career, touching every aspect of the growing state's development. Her educational institutions became models for progressive learning, while her hospitals pioneered new approaches to frontier medicine. But perhaps her greatest contribution was the example she set for other women, proving that courage and determination could overcome even the most entrenched social expectations. The final chapter of their story was written not in dramatic confrontation or public triumph, but in the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. When Jake Morrison finally laid down his badge at the age of 65, he had served with distinction for over 20 years without a single serious complaint about his conduct. The former outlaw had become the embodiment of justice tempered with mercy, exactly as Sarah had always known he could be. Their golden years were spent in the same house they had built together in Dust Creek, now grown into a small city that bore little resemblance to the rough frontier settlement where they had first met. They would sit together on their front porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold, and remembering the incredible journey that had brought them to this peaceful conclusion. When Sarah Morrison passed away at the age of 78, the entire state mourned the loss of one of its most beloved citizens. Her funeral drew thousands of mourners, including several former outlaws whose lives had been changed by her example of redemption and forgiveness. Jake Morrison, now white-haired and bent with age, delivered her eulogy with the same quiet dignity that had marked his transformation from wanted man to respected citizen. "She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself," he told the assembled crowd, his voice still strong despite his advancing years. "She looked at a broken man and saw someone worth saving. That gift of sight, that ability to see past the surface to the soul beneath, was Sarah's greatest talent. She used it to transform not just my life, but the lives of everyone she touched." Jake Morrison lived for 3 more years after his wife's death, spending his final days writing detailed memoirs of their extraordinary partnership. His account of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed both their lives became the definitive historical record of one of the American West's most significant corruption scandals, ensuring that the truth would be preserved for future generations. When death finally came for the former outlaw-turned-lawman, he was found peacefully in his chair, pen still in hand, working on the final chapter of a story that had begun with a mysterious letter and a desperate gamble on human redemption. His last written words were a tribute to the woman who had saved him. Sarah Mitchell Morrison saw a man who could change, and in seeing it, she made it possible. The legacy of their remarkable partnership lived on in the institutions they had built, the lives they had touched, and the example they had set for everyone who heard their story. In a time and place where justice was often rough and mercy was rare, they had proven that understanding and compassion could triumph over hatred and vengeance, that second chances could lead to remarkable transformations, and that sometimes the most unlikely love stories could change the course of history itself. Their graves in Dust Creek's hilltop cemetery bear a simple inscription that captures the essence of their extraordinary journey. Sarah and Jake Morrison, she saw the man he could become. He became the man she always knew he was. It stands as a testament to the power of faith, love, and the unshakable belief that no person is beyond redemption if someone cares enough to look past their failures to their possibilities.